What's up? Welcome back to Barton and Bud. I'm Barton Simmons with Bud Elliott, and we've got more Big Ten, some Big Ten, and a Big Ten game canceled. Wisconsin and Nebraska no longer. As we record this, Chris Hummer is punching out a column about how the Big Ten is basically screwed to a certain. I think that's going to be the gist of his column, because I don't know how the hell you're supposed to have a season with 8 games, no bye week, 21-day quarantine if you get COVID, and 5% of the roster affected necessitates a 7-day shutdown. Those are pretty restrictive. So, the first indication of some of the challenges the Big Ten is popping this weekend with a top 10 ranked, top 15 ranked, I'm not sure what they're ranked, Wisconsin team hanging it up. But we got a lot of stuff that we'll be talking about today, mainly in preparation for the weekend. Bud, what you got, man? How you doing?
Doing well, man. Bought a new TV and hung that thing up last night just in time to see the Rays lose to the Dodgers and lose the World Series. So that sucked, but it still looks pretty nice. Our old TV finally went, or I thought it went, and then I flipped it back on after I received the new TV, and it worked fine. But it's like, well, I'm not going to take this thing back to the store. So
okay. How big are we rocking here?
Went 75, and that's
75. That's
dude,
pretty strong.
Yeah. I was telling my wife, I was like, babe, we really could have gone 82, and she's looking at me like I'm a crazy person. And I was kind of joking, and then I kept playing the bid up, and just to see if she didn't bite. She's like, no, you're insane.
Just feeling her out for the next upgrade.
Basically, yeah. Man, so I'm interested to see a lot of these games this weekend. We're going to have to substitute one in our Barton and Bud preview for Wisconsin, Nebraska. That was a line that was crashing, by the way. It started out at like, I think 12-ish and then dropped down to 3 before the game was eventually pulled. But
I was anxious to ride Wisconsin because everyone, they're down to, the 4th string quarterback, and how they're going to generate any yards on offense. I was starting to like my chances. Like, if you got Wisconsin, if you got Nebraska catching like double digits, then congratulations. But once that started ticking down, the lower it got, the more I liked Wisconsin just being resourceful enough to piece together a game plan with whoever they're going to put at quarterback and find a way to win. So missed opportunity there.
I was just waiting it out. I was like, are we going to get Wisconsin as a dog here or as like a pick? I mean, that would be, I think, pretty good value. I don't think the drop off between Wolf and Vanderbloom is really that big. I understand the move from obviously Graham Mertz to the 3rd stringer, but 3rd to 4th string, I mean, whatever. So let's go. That was always going to be the undercard, though, I think, for this week, because even though there's a little bit of shine off this game, we have to start Ohio State at Penn State. It's the Kirk Herbstreit game. It's like the game of the day. One team played very well and won. One team probably deserved to win, but did not, because it did a lot of the little things wrong and had some turnovers go against it. I think we should probably start with the things that I feel a little more confident in, right? And that's Ohio State's offense and Penn State's defense. Now, Penn State lost Micah Parsons in the offseason, but that defense still looked really good to me against Indiana. Like, that was a misleading final score as far as the number of points allowed. We covered it on the Sunday night recap show. I think you said they had 170 yards before the final drive.
No. I think if my math is right, they had 111, because they ended up with 211, had a 75-yard drive, and had 25 yards in overtime. So 111 yards. They ended up with 211 on the game before the final drive for Indiana.
So they can do some things to Ohio State's offense, I think, that Nebraska could not. They have the pass rushers in Jason Owe and the other dude on the other side.
Shaka Tony.
Yeah. Like, they have guys who can get after it up front. They're not going to play a bunch of soft umbrella stuff, I don't think, like Nebraska did. I think they'll get up there and challenge the Ohio State receivers, some. When Nebraska tried to play man, it was the space they had on those crossing routes over and over again was just huge. I actually put those highlights this morning on the new flat screen just to watch it again. And I was seeing, okay, just how was Justin Fields successful here? And he made some really good throws and like that offense passing game wise is in sync. But Nebraska also lacks defensive team speed, in my opinion. And I think Penn State, there's a reason they play Ohio State tough. And last year, you can tell me they were close to getting blown out and that some turnovers kind of shifted that game to make it closer. And I don't disagree with that. But they still play Ohio State tougher, I think, than anybody else in the Eastern Division regularly, between James Franklin and Urban Meyer, between James Franklin and Ryan Day. I think if Ohio State is going to pull the blowout here, and they're favored by 12 as we record this, which I don't know. I'm not super anxious to lay that. I think Ohio State's offense has to become more two-dimensional, and they have to be able to run the football. And even against Nebraska, which is, I don't think, a very good defense, their backs, they didn't give me anything special. They kind of got what the offensive line got and nothing more. And then sometimes they actually didn't even get what the offensive line got because they were missing holes. I thought there were several runs in that game where the back was either not on the right track or did not stay on the right track and just missed his aiming point. So I don't think that they can go and just throw the entire time against Penn State and drop 50 plus. They need to have these backs step up.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think one of the intriguing things about this matchup to me, so we know how good Ohio State's wide receivers are. Olave, Garrett Wilson, as good a duo as there is. The young guys are going to start to step up. We saw Jackson Smith-Jigba had a touchdown. Julian Fleming had a catch. So those guys will keep on getting inserted more into the game plan as the season progresses. I think the thing that maybe isn't talked about enough with Penn State, and that I believe to be true, is I think Penn State has maybe the best defensive backfield in the Big Ten. I don't know if I'm on an island with that or if that's more commonplace, but between Tariq Castro-Fields at one corner, Joey Porter Jr., who's the redshirt freshman, who looked to me very impressive against Indiana last weekend, and who was always a guy I felt like whenever it hit for him, whenever he was ready physically, whenever he got on the field, and I like the upside developmentally was like enormous. And it looks like that's starting to take for him. Jaquan Brisker and Lamont Wade at the safety positions, like, and that's just sort of the four starters, but they've got a lot of depth, a lot of bodies they can throw in there, and 5 DB, 6 DB sets, and there's guys, whether it's Keaton Ellis, or, I don't know, Jonathan Sutherland, like there's a lot of guys that are capable within that secondary. And so I think that they are equipped, and because it's complemented well with a defensive line that can get to the quarterback. So ultimately, that's the crux of this challenge to me for Ohio State, and why Penn State has a chance is because, yeah, we're still, and we'll talk about offense and defensive matchups, we're still sort of having a lot of questions about what Penn State's capable of offensively, and certainly the consistency they're able to present offensively. But defensively, I think, particularly in the Big Ten, I think Ohio State is the most equipped team to defend this Ohio State team that they will face. With that said, it's going to be fascinating. Like if Ohio State blows it out, or if they just, get to 42 or something against this defense, then, I mean, good luck the rest of the way. Anybody else, whether Penn State's collective 11 is the best 11 defense in the conference. I mean, Wisconsin's got a pretty good case to make as well. I just like that defensive backfield, and that to me is going to determine whether or not Penn State can actually keep up with this game by limiting some of those big plays.
I completely agree there. I mean, if it's not Penn State as far as the best defensive backfield, it is Ohio State. And I think you may be able to run on this Penn State defense, but Ohio State's run game didn't look good. Are you concerned they had to run Justin Fields 15 times against Nebraska? Like, that seemed like a lot. And a lot of those were designed. I know a couple of them were quarterback sneaks. I think he had 2 or 3 sneaks. So if you pull out those, you're still talking double-digit runs for him against Nebraska. They need to have either Trey Sermon step up. Crowley's out, obviously, so he can't be the guy. Master Teague, maybe. I don't know. Like it doesn't seem like Ohio State has a true stud running back right now to make a difference, and they're gonna have to play into Penn State's hands.
Yeah, they're just guys back there, I think, at running back, and I think that they're good enough. I do sort of anticipate that Ohio State probably was always going to give Justin Fields a better opportunity to run this year because, I mean, I think they built their depth up a little better than it was last year. I think that there's probably a YOLO mentality for a lot of teams this season. Like, look, we got the best player in college football potentially. Let's utilize him and all his talents. And so I guess I don't know that to be true, but I wouldn't surprise me if that was the approach they took. But I agree with your point. I mean, this is a underwhelming rushing attack from the backfield, and it's a really good offensive line. And so it's not as if there is any reason to think that they shouldn't be able to pick up a lot of yards on the ground in a traditional run game. So I think that, finding that and keeping Justin Fields fresh is probably going to be a worthy balance to try to strike against a defense that's as opportunistic as Penn State's is. So, like that's going to be something to watch for sure. And just, finding ways for Penn State or Ohio State to stay ahead of the chains, because look, as good as those wide receivers are, I don't think you want to be in a bunch of 3rd and 9s with that secondary. I'm so interested in that matchup because maybe I'm just wrong about that. We got a 1-game sample size, and Ohio State's receivers might be that good, but it's balance is probably going to have to be come into play in this one.
All right. To me, this game kind of feels a little bit like Bama Georgia light. Okay, I think Penn State's defense is very good, but I'm not going to pretend that I'm picking Penn State here. I'm picking Ohio State, just like I was picking Alabama, because there's just no way in hell I'm going to pick Sean Clifford to upset a team that has more talent than him and has Justin Fields running the show. So let's go ahead and go to Ohio State's defense and Penn State's offense, because this is really the wild card side of things, I think. And if Ohio State was to get beat here, it's probably because they have some sort of defensive letdown in addition to some surprise turnovers by the Penn State defense. So let's nitpick Ohio State a little bit if we can, because otherwise it's just going to be a rundown. All right, Ohio State will kill them, and maybe they will. Ohio State's defensive line against Nebraska, honestly, man, it wasn't great. Their backers against the run, they didn't dominate. I was a little bit perplexed about some of the substitution patterns that Ohio State was using. Like Harrison for them didn't play much early in the game, and then came on later in the game and looked better. So I don't know. There's obviously nobody at practice at these things, so I don't know specifically why guys like Harrison weren't playing early in the game, because I think he's one of their most talented guys as an edge rusher and a run stopper, and he wasn't in there early. As the game wore on, he got in and they played more. So did he miss some time in camp that we don't know about, and thus they're working him back into the lineup slowly? Is there some kind of off-field thing? I'm not saying there is, but there's got to be some reason that he's not starting for them. And I want to know, is he going to start for them in this game? Or are we going to get 50 or 60 snaps of him and the other guys up front who kind of came on later? It was weird. I don't think they had their best guys out early against Nebraska, and Nebraska handled their dudes who are not known studs fairly well with their line. Penn State kept the ball for 40 minutes against Indiana. I think they want to try to play keep away here. We know Kirk Soraka loves to run the ball. He loves to go deep and throw RPO shots deep, but man, he loves to run the ball. That's how Penn State keeps us close. And so I have a question. Is Ohio State's defensive line, are they 2018 Clemson good? Can they can they be national championship good? There's maybe a little window there.
Is 2018 Clemson, was that the loaded defensive line?
Yeah, so that's probably the answer to that's probably a no. I'm just trying to think about or can they be LSU 2019 good? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's probably the better comparison.
Yeah. I my eyes told me that Ohio State's defense was a little bit softer than would be ideal. But I also, the final score was 52-17,
Right.
and I wasn't gonna sort of lose any sleep over it. But I did, as you were talking, I was just sort of looking up some of the analytics on Ohio State's defense, and it's worse than I expected. And granted, this is very small sample size. There's a 1-game sample size relative to the rest of the country, some of which have played, 5 games, 6 games. Rushing success rate defensively, they're 100th in the country. Standard down success rate, 101st in the country. Passing success rate, 97th in the country. I mean, there's a lot of not great in there, and that's just this 1 game, and they played against a Nebraska team that was had a good game plan, was still wasn't able to generate many points, but was able to stay ahead of the chains, and that just kind of worked out for them, for Ohio State. But it is sort of the type of thing that you kind of raise your eyebrows at and make sure that you're that you're acknowledging what it was last week. And so so now we got Noah Cain out for Penn State. Journey Brown was already out. We're down to Devin Ford and the 2 freshmen. I mean, Penn State is going to have to, I think, play keep away to a certain degree. And that's got to be their game plan to a certain degree. Are you confident in those running backs that they have remaining being able to execute that? And surely Sean Clifford has got a couple big throws in him, and they've got a couple big plays in him in the pass game, but that's ultimately Penn State is still going to want to grind it out. I don't know. How big of a departure at the running back position do you think it is?
I think it is a significant departure. I mean, Noah Cain he's basically a success rate back. He's not an explosive runner. He's not a game breaker, but he is really good at getting like what the line blocks him +2, and falling forward. He's always keeping them ahead of the chains. I think the game against Iowa last year or 2 years ago, he's a sophomore? Try to remember what.
Yeah, he's sophomore.
So the year they played at Iowa, it had to be last year then, when he kept them ahead of the chains basically the entire time. Like, that's a good example to me of what he brings to that offense against a quality defense like in Iowa. So to your point about the success rate stuff, just to give the listeners a point of reference here, we've seen how Alabama's defenses got ripped up at times this year. Okay, Alabama's success rate allowed on standard downs 40%. Ohio State 70%. I mean, that's a big deal. Now, Nebraska, not good in pass pro. Obviously, Taylor Martinez, not a great thrower of the football, and Nebraska did not have Omar Manning, as we noted. Once Ohio State got Nebraska to a passing down, it was night-night termite. But when Nebraska was able to stay ahead of the chains, they could throw play action. They tried to hit some shots. Ohio State did not actually allow the deep shots. This is the recipe for Penn State, is to stay ahead of the chains, because all the RPO stuff that Kirk Ciarrocca likes to do is not effective on 3rd and 9. I mean, you can RPO me all you want. I'm still just going after the passer. Cool. All right. I think this has to be a big Sean Clifford running game to offset. Like if this is the game, if it takes 20 carries from him, he's not an NFL guy anyway. Like if I'm James Franklin, I'm dialing that up. I'm having Sean Clifford take off a lot, try to stay ahead of the chains and play some stuff, kind of outside the context of the offense there. They've got to try to find a way to get explosive plays, man.
Yeah, and you know what? Their wide receivers, whether it's Jahan Dotson, I do think Pat Freiermuth is a problem, but he's, to this point, he's been more of a get you a first down, not get you a touchdown sort of guy. And so at some point they've got to lean in a little bit there. Maybe Parker Washington, a true freshman who's starting, we've seen in other places that have played some, more body of work, where freshmen have started to emerge the more that they've experienced the game, the more they've had an opportunity to get in. So maybe that starts to happen with Parker Washington. I don't know. I will say we probably, I think that was I like the way you phrased that Noah Cain is sort of a success rate back. Journey Brown was sort of everything you need, because he's got the big playability. He's super athletic. Like, they're missing the Saquon Barkley there for their offense in Journey Brown. Noah Cain is their first down machine. They're ahead of the chains machine. They're on schedule guy. I think that Kevon Lee, the true freshman, might be their best option to be a stay on schedule back in this game. So I do wonder if you see a lot of the true freshmen at running back this week. Devin Ford, a little more of the big play potential, because Keziah Holmes is the other back in that backfield, and he's a little more versatile than those guys. But it sounds like maybe just Kevon Lee's the one that seems to be emerging the most. So I wouldn't be surprised if their game plan doesn't change a whole lot, but I wonder if the carries and the workload is sort of shifted over to the true freshman a little bit.
Do you know anything about their other tight ends? Because in listening to the Bucknuts,
studs.
I would go multiple tight ends here a lot if I'm Penn State. I know Soraka was able to do that some at Minnesota. And listening to the Bucknuts Morning 5 podcast, which I listen to every morning, man, I got to tell you, like, those guys who cover Ohio State, they love that secondary. I mean, Sevyn Banks and Shaun Wade and those dudes are locked down, and they have depth there in the secondary. They are not real impressed so far with the front seven. I think one of your goals of your Penn State is to make Ohio State play a front seven and not a front six, and make them stay in personnel packages that are not well suited to them. So I would try to go multi-tight ends as much as I can here, which can also help your run game.
Yeah, Penn State's tight end room is loaded. Farmer's the guy, but Brendan Strange, and then they've got a couple young guys that are going to be really good. I don't know if they're ready or not, but that would be, I like that. I like that. We'll see if that happens.
Ohio State didn't really allow anything explosive through the air against Nebraska. Nebraska's not a super explosive passing offense anyway, but worth noting that Penn State didn't do anything explosive either. They had a 2% marginal explosiveness edge at Indiana through the air. That's really not going to get it done. Ball control, turnovers, ugly. That's your shot, Lions. And that's kind of it, I think.
You want to move on to Texas, Oklahoma State?
Yeah, I mean, we went, what do we go, 15, 20 minutes on that? But I feel like that's the game of the week. It's the game of the year in the Big Ten. Might as well go deep. This actually, as Twitter reminds us here, this Texas Oklahoma State game was my preseason Big 12 pick against yours. And I got to say, to this point, you're looking better than I am here.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, this is the type of game, though, where, nothing would shock me. And I think Oklahoma State is – it's just the question is just kind of like how much confidence has Texas built in a win over Baylor? I didn't watch a lot of that game, but and it didn't seem like it was a dominating affair. More of just they kind of took care of business, and Baylor maybe wasn't quite up for the task. But I still think you're going to I still think this is one of those games where, like, what's the unit that's the best on the field? And how many times have we say this when in a Texas versus Oklahoma State game where the best unit on that field would be an Oklahoma State defense? But that's the way I feel in this game. And I still think that, like, Texas's offense, like, Ellinger's been a little bit less accurate and consistent than usual. Their run game, like, inexplainably continues to be absent. Their wide receivers, to me, have been very average. Like, I don't see them creating a lot of separation unless they're just schemed open. So I still have a lot of questions about Texas, and I think Spencer Sanders is very turnover
prone.
Yeah, there you go, turnover prone. But I think that as long as he just doesn't end a disaster, like, I still think that Oklahoma State knows what it is a little bit more on offense.
Yeah, I think I'm right there with you. I do think Texas defense is improving some week to week, but at the same time, guys, like I told you about Michigan State, Baylor's offense is sneaky bad. Like they are really, I thought Larry Fedora there would go up tempo, would have that thing continuing to be solid. And they have taken a big step back from where they were last year. They really can't throw the ball. Their run game's not good. And on top of that, Dave Aranda kneecaps his own team by doing things like punting from the opponent 30-yard line for a touchback. So nice 10-yard net there in exchange for not having a possession.
Now his running back said, "Thanks, coach," and just opted out. So we're good.
Yeah,
we'll see you next year.
We're not in for this. And yet, this Oklahoma State, this betting line for this game, I took Oklahoma State at 3. I thought the line should have been more about 6. It's still only 3.5, man. Like Vegas is not buying in on Oklahoma State yet, and I maybe they don't think Spencer Sanders is that much of an upgrade, but I think he is an upgrade. I think his legs are an upgrade. They didn't have to run him, a ton against Iowa State. Now, part of that's probably because he's coming off injury. Maybe they don't want to risk it. But Texas this year, if you look at defensively what they've done poorly, there's a lot. Okay, there is a lot, but they have given up explosive runs. That's kind of the one thing that stands out in bright red on their stat sheet. Chuba Hubbard and Spencer Sanders in the run game here, I trust to move the ball on Texas. Now, maybe this is the game that Oklahoma State's defense gets tested some. I mean, they really haven't. Nobody's got them so far at all. They've been lights out. I put Jim Knowles, their DC, as my coordinator of the year pick in our 24/7 Sports mid-year awards that we published today. Although Barry Odom's probably a better choice. That slipped my mind. I know a lot of guys had him, and Sarkisian at Bama's good too. But like I think Oklahoma State is a decently good enough football team to win this game. I think they should be favored by a little bit more here. So I'm riding with the Pokes. And we do have a couple Tom Herman hot seat questions. Do you think these are fair? I think it's also entirely possible that Texas, if they win this, they could go on a run. They next games, West Virginia at Kansas, hosts Iowa State at Kansas State. If Tom Herman gets this, they could easily finish on a 6-game winning streak.
Yeah, which is like such is the nature of the Big 12 and the nature of Tom Herman, really. I mean, he's just like, he's a little bit of the Gus Malzahn of the Big 12, just teetering on national championship contention and hot seat by like a game-by-game basis. I think it's fair to have him on the hot seat. I think it's fair to want more. I think he's been like there's something to be said for being likable. And I think the fan base doesn't seem that anxious to like grant him a whole lot of mercy and grace. I think because he's just a little bit I don't know what the word is. I don't know.
I know what the word is, but we're it's a CBS, like that's our parent company. So,
it's so, but like, I mean, look, if you're, and he could, like you said, he could sit here and rattle some wins off and get him in the Big 12 championship game and get him a Big 12 championship. And that's all stuff is well within the reason. And then he's very clearly off the hot seat, but, as long as the jump continues to miss Texas, I mean, he's going to have to deal with that. The expectations are high when you take a job like that.
It's also not just the record. It's how they look in some of these games. If they were playing well, this gets back to a question that we got on Twitter a couple weeks back about how come like when Iowa State and TCU and to some extent Oklahoma State, when they're good, or when they're on top of the Big 12, they don't get the credit. And the answer typically is that they have really not, with the exception of that Oklahoma State team that in 2011, which arguably should have played for the national title. When those teams are on top of the Big 12, it is generally not because that they are nationally elite teams. It's because either Oklahoma or Texas are down. Similar to, honestly, to how like Boston College and Virginia Tech were in the mid 2000s and that one year at Wake Forest in the ACC. people out there have enough common sense to realize, are the Hokies and Eagles and Demon Deacons really dominant teams, or is there some major dysfunction going on at Clemson, Miami, Florida State, the teams that we know have the ability to sign the super elite athletes? And there's a little bit of that going on in the Big 12, I think, this year, but also in years in which some of those other teams get off to a hot start. And people are smart enough to realize, all right, Texas is not playing to its potential, to its ability to get talent. And maybe there's some bigger issues there. Gosh, honestly, at A&M too, sometimes with their ability to quote unquote get talent, and yet they don't traditionally win. I mean, over like 100 years of data, like we think maybe they should. But I think it's how they look sometimes, man. It just looks poorly coached at times. It's. I also like. Do you go get Urban Meyer?
That's the problem. If you can get Urban Meyer, hell yeah, like hot seat him up. But you are still. I mean, we thought Tom Herman was that dude when he was hired, and so you always have to measure these conversations with the counterbalance of, well, who can you get? And so I don't know who they get if they don't get Urban Meyer, and I don't know who you get that you're confident is the right hire if you don't get Urban Meyer. Urban Meyer is a no-brainer. Urban Meyer is a hit. Urban Meyer will be successful. Urban Meyer will get Texas where it hadn't been. Like, Urban Meyer is going to bring consistency and discipline and all that sort of stuff. I mean, he's done it every other stop. So, but he's the only no doubter.
I agree. I mean, we talk about Texas. Why is Texas such a good job? And there are negatives about it, right? You got to deal with a lot of powerful people who think they're even more powerful than they are. You got to kiss a lot of ass. You got to kiss a lot of babies. But Urban Meyer is a guy who is a resource hound and a resource maximizer, much like Nick Saban. He's going to come in and demand a whole lot. He's not going to take a job that doesn't have elite level resources, and he generally has very good results wherever he goes. Now, sometimes when he leaves, Florida didn't work out great. Ohio State is working out awesome. Utah actually worked out really well. So there's the narrative out there that when he leaves, the place is a mess. When he leaves, it's not always super clean, but like 2 of the last 3 jobs he's had, he left him in good hands. So I if you go get Urban Meyer, cool, but I just don't know who else is out there that you really want to get unless you're thinking NFL.
Is there literally a person out there that you think of when you think of that job other than Urban?
There's really not, man. Like who would you?
Like, there's not an obvious hire, is there? Other than Urban?
Not off the top of my head. Now, there are some hires maybe I could be talked into if somebody wants to make that case and say, okay, this fits. This guy's does this and this. Maybe there is an NFL guy. Joe Brady, who I don't think would be a fit because he doesn't. I don't think he has that cachet and the ability to deal with all those boosters and people there. I do think Texas is the job that you kind of need a name or someone who has the track record to say, hey, you know what, I got this. Shut up. And I don't know that one of these like hotshot coordinator types has the ability. And yet, if you hindsight this thing, man, Tom Herman was an excellent fit. He didn't play at Texas, but he was a coach at Texas before. He had coached under Urban Meyer as a national championship coordinator. So you had the play calling pedigree, you had the understanding X and O pedigree, and then you also had him actually managing and running a program at Houston and maximizing that. So like he had the best of both worlds, head coach experience and quality coordinator experience in recruiting at the highest level. And it still hasn't worked out, which I think is a good example of why these things are crapshoots. Do you have an obvious candidate?
No, I don't. But I also think maybe the best candidate at Texas isn't an obvious candidate anymore. Like, it's time to get away from the obvious candidates. I think it might be time if a Texas move were to be made, I think it might be time for them to go like a Matt Rule type. You know what I mean? Like, they've gone the no doubt, big OC, like Charlie Strong was a hot name too. Like I think you need to like look under the hood and make sure you're getting someone that's a builder of culture, a builder of like that. Like, I think that's the most important part, is like creating a culture, creating an environment there, as opposed, like, you should be able to recruit well enough. And so it's a little bit like kind of what Florida needed to go towards is, because they sort of had a couple whiffs there. And I think Dan Mullen was a good hire because I don't know, he's going to be able to handle there's an element that Dan Mullen is going to be very competent in handling. And that was an important element. Like that was the team building. That was the on-field product. And I just think Texas they've been missing on that for some reason.
The only counter I would make to that, and I agree, I think if you let Texas, will Texas give that guy time? Will they give him space to do it?
No, they may not. And I'm not even confident in that profile. I just would like to see it a little bit. Like you may be right. Like you might have to just go hire just big balls McGee, who just can go and say F you to all the boosters and or shake all the hands or whatever it is, whatever like the booster personality you have to have over there to be able to pull all the levers and get stuff done. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe you just need the big persona, but man, it would be fun to see someone that's like a little more nuanced in the way they want to build a program, try to get it done there.
I mean, like 10 years ago, Gary Patterson, I think easily could have done it. Now, granted, I mean, he's had struggles at TCU recently. I think it's hard to maintain the level they were at a program like TCU long term. But this is a fascinating discussion, man. We actually, I think, had 3 or 4 iTunes questions about Tom Herman and Urban Meyer and what would you go get? I would probably sit tight unless I had somebody who I really liked. But it is worth noting, Chris Del Conte, their AD, did not hire him. He inherited him. So
there's going to be Texas is actually the type of team that could make a hire this cycle if they had someone they like, because there's no competition this cycle. It's going to be a very slow coaching carousel, and Texas is really the only big domino looming. So that's an interesting element in all this, is just sort of the opportunity to be the only team shopping.
A domino that would be too, because that means some team whose coach is getting taken now has a bunch of buyout money to go buy out somebody else's coach. Like that's how it happens here. Is if one of those big schools, really big schools like a Herman, makes a move, that would be like would they go in conference and get a Matt Campbell? I don't know. I don't know if I see that or not. Is that big enough for them? I think the guy knows how to build a program. Iowa State punches above its weight class. I mean, we had Chris Hummer ready to write a story about how, like, if Iowa State had beaten Oklahoma State last week, it's a little look behind the curtain. Iowa State had not won a conference, I believe, outright since 1913. And I don't even know which conference it was. You got to look up on Wikipedia. I mean, you're talking about sustained success above and beyond about 100 years of history and maximizing program there at Iowa State. That would make sense to me. I just don't know if that's big enough and flashy enough for them. Maybe it is.
Yeah.
Or maybe Herman turns it around.
Yeah, we'll see. I think a Matt Campbell-ish would be fun experiment at Texas, but I'm not sure they're ready to have that sort of engage in that sort of experiment either.
All right, so you got 5 minutes for radio. You want to go LSU Auburn in 5?
Yeah.
All right. So kind of no huddle portion here. We had to substitute in somebody for the Wisconsin-Nebraska game, and we chose LSU Auburn because there are some interesting injury situations here. Both these teams are, I don't know if at crossroads, but this is certainly an important game. If you win this game, it keeps you in the race to be second in the SEC West, which I think is important. That you can say, okay, we finished second to Bama. It's a little more embarrassing if you finish second to like A&M or Auburn or LSU this year. If you lose this game, the chance you go 4-6 is actually, decently high. So pretty important ball game here. 2 notes that I want to spit out, and then you go from here. It probably is going to be TJ Finley again for LSU. I saw it reported today on Twitter, multiple spots, that Miles Brennan has not practiced yet this week for LSU and is not expected to go with that abdominal injury. And then Auburn, which had offensive line issues to start the year. They had to go out and take a bunch of transfers. Brandon Council, the offensive guard or tackle, I forgot, who they got from Akron, he was starting for them, and now he's out for the year. Auburn is sneaky thin as far as quality defensive linemen right now. Can Finley keep the magic going? Can Auburn block well enough to give Bo Nix some time to create some explosive plays against LSU's defense? Those are kind of the two angles I'm watching for.
Fortunately, they're going up against an LSU defense that hadn't done much stopping of anybody lately. Even against South Carolina, who they ended up winning fairly handily against, but they were South Carolina moved the ball. They were pretty effective and efficient throughout the day and just getting yards. So I think, did you see Siaki Ika from LSU defensive lineman is transferring?
He is?
Yeah, so that hit our Slack room here a few minutes ago.
I snoozed the notifications on Slack during the pod. Maybe I shouldn't.
No, I mean, it's you're probably a little bit more focused in your talking points than I am because I'm scattered. But that's a pretty big one for a defensive line that wasn't like it's almost 1 for 1. Okay, Brandon Council's out. Well, Siaki Ika's out for LSU too. I don't know who wins on that one. So
he was getting a lot of snaps for them, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was one of. I just did a story on LSU today on their underclassmen, their freshmen specifically, and the kind of impact they're making. Is Siaki Ika was one of their top players according to PFF. But that is sort of the point I would make on LSU is this season is all kind of gravy. It's when you look at the way the freshman class is starting to pop. TJ Finley having a competent day, downright good day. Forget competent. I mean, he was good. BJ Ojulari, 3 sacks against South Carolina. Eric Gilbert, their number 2 leading receiver on the year. Their cornerback, Elias Ricks, got 3 interceptions in 4 games, 1 return for a touchdown. He's their top defensive. Ojulari and Ricks are currently their top 2 graded defenders according to PFF. This is a team that reloaded really effectively. It just didn't have a chance to sort of onboard those guys in the spring and summer. It's doing it right now. And so I think this team is going to get a lot better as the season progresses. And whatever the 2020 schedule or record ends up looking like, it's going to produce, I think, really strong results for that 2021 season. So this is the next test in that, but you got to like what you've seen to this point from the underclassmen.
I agree. And man, if Auburn goes out there and loses to a bunch of true freshmen from LSU, those Auburn fans are going to go nuts. Like losing a home game to a bunch of true freshmen, that's not a great recipe for Gus. Although, as our Brandon Marcello noted, his buyout's $21.5 million with half due like immediately. So that's probably not going to happen there at Auburn. Like that's kind of a step above even Auburn crazy, paying a $20 million buyout in a pandemic. But I'm excited to see this, dude. And this is kind of if you think Ed Orgeron is Gene Chizik and is a one-year wonder guy, this is kind of your counter to that. Hey, you know what? Like there weren't a whole lot of signs that Gene Chizik was building something, to now granted, I mean, Gus did take them to the national title in year 2 with a lot of Chizik's guys, but it wasn't obvious at the time. Here it's obvious that LSU actually is being able to reload some matchup wise in this game. Man, Seth Williams against, Stingley. Yeah. That's going to be really, really interesting. Like can the number 2 and 3 guys for Auburn step up on the outside against Ricks and them? Can you throw the ball underneath on LSU? I think you can. I'm excited to watch this one.
Yeah, and I'm curious. My theory on true freshman quarterbacks that ball out in the first start and come back down to earth in the second start is going to be tested this week because LSU's offense has been pretty bulletproof, and TJ Finley sure did look under control last game. So I'm anxious to see whether game 2 for the Fish is going to be. I don't know how it's going to look.
Ditto. All right, man. Well, after this ad break, we're going to come back, maybe talk a little recruiting trends, take a couple mailbag questions. We got a bunch of good mailbag questions. So we're going to dive in to a couple that I think are relevant for everybody and not just one team, and maybe talk about a couple little trends we're watching. maybe we'll shelve that. Just depends on how much time we have left in the show. All right, man, welcome back. So because one of our goals on this show is to merge recruiting and football, and I'd like to make sure we still talk recruiting during football season, let's just go ahead and fill the listeners in on some stuff we're watching here at 24/7 Sports. I know one of the things I'm watching is some of these really like blue chip schools are coming around on some of the offers that were thrown out by some of the lesser blue chip type schools, and deciding that some of these 3-stars who those schools offered earlier in the process, maybe they're actually a little bit better than they realize. Maybe they're pulling up some of that. As I'm sure you get sent a lot of these, I do as well. These mid-season huddle highlight tapes from these guys' senior years, and I'm all too happy to get them now because we didn't have camp season for the most part this summer, or not a normal one at least. So I'm excited to watch as much as I can. And it looks like some of these college staffs are watching and making decisions as well on this, because we've seen a couple flips. We've seen a couple potential flips here in the last couple of days.
Yeah, I thought the Shea Dixon, who's one of our studs on the boots on the ground at the LSU site, wrote a story on LSU's. We talked about LSU, all their young guys that are playing right now and doing well. And Shea dug in a little bit on sort of what LSU's done and the success they've had recruiting 3-stars, particularly in-state 3-stars. And they've really crushed it. And it kind of, ironically, LSU, I feel like they will chase rankings. That's like Ed Orgeron, I think, pays attention to rankings. He wants the number 1 class.
Did you read Meat Market? Yeah.
Yeah. Like he don't even hide from it. So in some cases, I feel like they'll even take guys that are higher rated that sometimes are not great takes, especially early in the process, and they'll drop them or whatever. But one thing that is counter to that you can't argue with is their success rate taking the 3-star guys. Because when they do reach on a guy that doesn't have the offer list, doesn't have the pedigree, the profile, they have a really strong hit rate, especially again for those in-state guys. Like there's a reason that they're taking them, and Shea goes into it, but it's a lot of NFL guys, first-round draft picks, guys that have started. Like those guys typically contribute. So with that said, I mean, it's kind of interesting. They flipped a kid, Matthew Langlois, who's an in-state kid who was committed to Kansas State, 3-star guy, high 3-star, but 3-star nonetheless. And he's a guy that is now committed to LSU. And, maybe people wouldn't be that excited about a Kansas State guy, but I think Shea's point is well taken that, well, you should be excited because when LSU, goes against the grain, it's pretty good track record. The other one that they've now offered is this kid, Jack Betch, who is committed to Vanderbilt, who I know Vanderbilt is super high on or has been. And now I guess LSU tends to agree. Another guy, an in-state wide receiver that they've now are pushing for. So just kind of an interesting something to follow. Like it's always interesting when the powerhouse programs, the blue bloods of the blue bloods, extend the offers to the 3-stars. And 3-stars are great players. 3-stars we acknowledge can be NFL guys, but those are the programs that don't typically have to dip into that pool of guys with questions. Like they can typically recruit just the guys that check every box resoundingly. And so it's always fun to sort of dig in and see if you can sort of see what they're seeing when they make an offer to a guy that may not have that same profile.
One thing I always did before I worked for 24/7, and now that we actually have access to the database and I have access to Chad Carson's DMs, I'm going to basically, I always like to track, okay, the top targets and the flips down the stretch that the big boys were signing. Who are they committed to? Right? Like which schools at the lower levels are doing a good job of offering these guys, of identifying them early, and of knowing which ones for which to press for a commitment, even if that commitment didn't ultimately hold, as in these cases it didn't or probably won't. Because that's always interesting to me. Kansas State, I think, is a good offering staff, a good evaluation staff. Minnesota has been one, and to his credit, PJ Fleck actually has done a really good job holding on to guys down the stretch, like Rashad Bateman, who I know Georgia and Florida State liked a whole heck of a lot in December of 2018. Guys like that, and there was one more. Boston College on the defensive side of the ball, I think is doing a really good job. I'm watching their commitment list. We're seeing more guys pop up who they've offered that are suddenly kind of picking up either interest, or you're seeing our 24/7 sports guys write stories. Hey, here's a guy that this staff at whatever big time SEC school is monitoring, right? And might get an offer, which is generally a precursor article to has been offered. Just haven't done it quite yet. That's something I intend to do even more now that I can ask Chad, hey, like guys who committed to, let's say, top 10 recruiting classes who were previously committed elsewhere, where were they committed and when? That's something I'm going to take a look at after signing day this year. I think it's going to be fascinating.
So we going mailbag?
Let's end on this mailbag. We got 2 questions here that I picked out that are kind of generic, so I think everybody might be interested.
All right, I'm gonna read this first one to you. This is from Dylan Okenfuss. Listener question. I would like to hear a step-by-step breakdown of how Bud goes through a box score in order to update his power rankings, including which sites box scores you use would be helpful as well. It's kind of an overwhelming process to me. Thank you.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say that I absolutely hate the one product that some of these schools are going to. What's it called? Sidearm, I believe, for their box scores. It's more difficult for me to navigate. I like to use Stat Broadcast personally. That's something that most schools make free. I just go to statbroadcast.com and pick out whichever team you want to look at their box score. Some of the schools password protected, including some weird schools. And I'm like, really? Like, how many people are trying to illicitly access your Stat Broadcast, Bowling Green? I mean, this is kind of silly. But anyway, I had the master password, so I'm not really concerned about that. What I try to do is I start with the score, and then the first thing I check out is when were the points scored in the game, just to try to get a feel for when it entered garbage time. Bill Connolly's definition of garbage time, who, good friend of mine, worked with him for a decade, 24 points in the fourth quarter, 28 in third, I think 38 in the first half, is generally when the game is considered garbage time. And then after that point, teams start acting and behaving differently as far as like attempting to come back in the game, that type of thing. So that generally stats that are accrued after that point are kind of noisy and oftentimes detrimental to your actual evaluation of the game. Then I take a look at how the points were scored. So did they come on big plays? Did they come via execution in the red zone? Most importantly, did they come on short fields or turnovers or special team scores? I try to look for things that are more repeatable skill than things that are heavily luck based. We know turnovers have a huge luck component. Scoring on turnovers, like actually taking them back, pick sixes, fumble sixes, have an even bigger luck rate than do just creating turnovers. And I think there's some skill in creating turnovers. It's just not. I don't think it's as repeatable as coaches wish it was. Otherwise, everybody would do it, and you would see the best teams always at the very top in terms of creating turnovers. And we don't really see that from year to year. So after that, I generally look at a couple things. Yards per play margin, as long as you strip out the garbage time, is a really good thing to look at. 20% yards of play margin, you're probably winning by a touchdown or more, sometimes, double digits. 30%, 40%, you're probably, winning by the teens to 20s. If you're anything over like 50 or 60% yards play margin, that's pretty damn good. Your blowouts that are over with 30 minutes or 40 minutes like to go, that's usually about 200 or 300% edge. Like Georgia Tech Clemson the other day was pretty huge. And then I look at like how many explosive plays each team creates. And I care about the number of explosive plays as opposed to just how big they were. Because again, getting back to things that are repeatable skill as opposed to what's not, we know that like creating explosive plays is more sustainable than creating like enormous explosive plays. There is a certain randomness element to your explosive play going for 80 yards as opposed to 30 or 40. So if you can create a lot of explosive plays, even if in this instance they all go for just 20 or 30, if you're good at creating explosive plays, there's a good chance that in the future you will actually create ones that go for 50, 60, 70. So that's important. Points inside the opponent 40-yard line. Or if you want to just make it simple, how many points did you get on drives that ended in opponent territory? On average is pretty pretty key because that's going to show you're either scoring on explosive plays or you're scoring because you executed once you got down in the tight area. I mean, those are kind of the two key things to look at there. And then I look at turnovers quickly just to see if there's anything weird, and then average starting field position, which is usually kind of affected by turnovers. And then I just try to quickly math it in my head. Okay, they were 15 yards better on average starting field position, and they had 10 drives. Okay, that's 150 yard starting field position edge. That's a pretty good one. Anything over 100 is something I take notice of. So I generally just try to, and I don't do all of these steps for every game. I try to just look at the score and then reverse engineer it until the score makes sense to me, and then I move on. Like that's kind of how I work it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think it is. That's something I've been trying to learn from you analytics types over the last few years, and it's been very helpful in identifying and recognizing when scores can be misleading, and sort of the cut through the noise and find some meaningful takeaways.
Yeah, it's really useful. And then the other thing is sometimes if it still doesn't make sense to me, there's so many places you can go watch highlights of these games, YouTube or, if you have YouTube TV, there's an option when you go to the recorded games. Sometimes it'll just say show key plays, and you can just kind of thumb through those until you see, oh, wait a second. Here's how this happened. This was actually a blocked punt, or for some reason, stat broadcast. Like the other night, Barton and I watched the Michigan-Minnesota game. Like we both actually had eyes on it. And then when we were looking back to the box score, we were like, wait a second. I thought they missed field goals, and it was, so the box scores aren't always perfect. I don't think it's a substitute for actually watching games, but let's be real here. Even those of us who work in the sport, we're not able to watch 30 games in a weekend. I got like 6 screens going if I'm sitting in my office. I got my 3 desktop screens. I got a laptop, an iPad, and I got the TV over my shoulder here. That's still like, it's impossible to watch all those games at one time. So like you do need the numbers, I think, to inform you, and then go back through the numbers and then through the highlights to try to figure out why something was the way it was.
All right. So our last question is from T. Starzl. He wonders if we see Bill O'Brien end up as a college head coach again. He did fairly well at Penn State, given what was going on at the time, and he's a solid play caller. He also has the coveted offensive guy label. It seems as though chances in the NFL will be pretty low, given that Watt basically openly torched him on the practice field. Can't imagine he'll have a lot of respect of the players. In some ways, Bill O'Brien is probably a better fit in college because he strikes me as the type of guy that wants to be kind of a micromanager. He wants to affect and control everything. But most of his background is NFL, and its bottom line is, can he recruit? So I don't know. I'm a little bit mixed on this one. I think he'd probably be a successful college head coach if that was the path he wanted to take. I don't know that that's the path he wants to take.
So you remember who he worked for before he was with Penn State?
Belichick, right?
And who has a habit of just acquiring former coordinators and coaches as part of his rehab school, and who has an offensive coordinator who might get a job somewhere, soon. Like maybe Butch Jones gets promoted to the Alabama OC job, and maybe Bill O'Brien is the next rehab candidate there in Tuscaloosa. And I agree with you. I think that based on the comments of his players in the NFL, I think you're right. It's this totalitarian control freak type thing, to where you can do that in college a little bit more than you can in the NFL, because the guys in the NFL have agents and families and contracts, and they kind of know where they stand as far as the balance of power between them and the head coach. In college, the players have far fewer rights for the most part, although that's changing a little bit. And there's a reason why we hear about these mistreatment stories coming out years later in college, and we really don't hear those in the NFL very much, because you can't get away with that in the NFL. In college, there are situations where coaches say and do stuff that's, pretty inflammatory, or just have, look, we saw some situations like that this summer. But yeah, I think he could be a better fit in college. Didn't he not love recruiting? I think it was. Wasn't that the deal?
Yeah, just like every NFL guy.
Yeah.
That's why they're in the NFL. They just want to coach. They just want to coach ball. Not a lot of people love that recruiting side of it. There's not a lot of Ed Ogerons and Mario Cristobal's out there. Those guys, they eat it up.
They do. They do. We love them for it. That's what we do here at 24/7 Sports, recruiting and football. And we really appreciate you guys subscribing to the show. If you're one of the folks who's on the message boards, and I try to put the show on all the message boards that about the teams we speak positively, of course, on a weekly basis. If you're just waiting for me to drop it on the message boards, first of all, I appreciate you going to those boards and frequenting those sites. But in that player, there's that subscribe button. Hit us up on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Google Podcasts or Stitcher or whatever you guys like. We're growing the subscriber numbers. We want to get them even more. We appreciate all the help y'all have given us with the Apple Podcast reviews. And I enjoy doing the show. This is probably my favorite part of the work week. So let's go, other than maybe breaking down the film and doing a recruiting meeting. But we actually have that coming up right after this, so we need to go.
All right. We'll talk to you.
See y'all.